It's Wednesday, March 5th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Trump tariffs are here. Canada is responding. My guests today will help us dig into the latest news, offer evolving thoughts on how to respond, and talk about what it means for us here in Newfoundland and Labrador. All right, with the end of the electric flute, we are off and running here. A quick word on the show for all of you listeners of The Signal. We've been talking a lot about how we do the show and what we do and why we do it. So, essentially, in this world of chaos and information overload, us here at The Signal, our job is, Arlette, John, and I, we find people who help us make sense of it all. Every day we tackle a new topic. So if it matters to you, we will dig into it and we'll learn about it together, talking about it together. A quick word for this show then. I've got some folks here in studio I'll introduce shortly. At the halfway point, we will open the phone lines to get your thoughts on the American tariffs, the responses, and what the impact might be for you personally, your business, your family, or us, all of us in Newfoundland and Labrador and, across the country. So, yesterday, right? I'm sure you know the news by now. U.S. President Donald Trump followed through on his long-threatened tariffs, imposed 25% levies on Canadian and Mexican imports and 10% on Canadian energy. Trump also doubled the tariff he slapped last month on Chinese products to 20%. Retaliation, Canada slapped 25% tariffs on $30 billion worth of American U.S. goods. Those tariffs will be applied to another $125 billion worth of imports after a 3-week consultation period. All right, my guests here in studio to talk about all this, to react, give us some analysis. We've got Rochelle Cote, Associate Professor at Department of Sociology and Faculty of Business Administration. Rochelle has written and presented on many aspects of social support, networks, social capital, reciprocity, ethnic tolerance, Indigenous entrepreneurship. Tom Cooper, Professor in Strategic Management at the Faculty of Business and Administration. And Tony Fang, Jaroslawski Chair in Economic and Cultural Transformation with the Economics Department. Folks, well, two of you, welcome back and welcome here for the first time.
Thank you.
Rochelle, kick us off. Where's your head at today?
Well, Adam, I think I was telling you when I first got here, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of information since Trump came into office. There's been a lot of activity. A lot of us are kind of just watching and holding our breath and waiting to see what is going to happen next. So I know I've been spending a lot of my time, and my job means that I have not only the luxury of time, but also it's a part of my job to follow what's going on and spend time thinking about it and trying to figure out how to explain it to people out there in the world, but also my students in my classrooms, right? So it's been a lot.
What are the students saying or asking when you're trying to explain stuff and talk to them?
So I think my students are concerned. They're wondering, what the impact is going to be to them personally, to their families, to this country, to the province. There's a lot there, right? So I think they're wondering also what they can be doing as students and as individuals, because the problem seems so big. And so what can I do as just one person to try to support the country, but also support my family and make a difference? And so I think that those are kind of the main things that are circling around in terms of conversations and thoughts and worries that my students are having.
Thank you. Tony Fang, question to you. Same thing. Where is your head at today? What are you thinking? As you walk in here with all the news happening, what are you thinking about today when it comes to tariffs and responses and everything else?
Adam, I happen to teach international economics, international trade, and finance this year. So I also have had time to explain what's going on here.
And you just stepped out of class, right?
Stepped out of a class.
So you stepped out of that class to come here to talk about the same thing. All right.
Right, exactly. So, essentially it's moving targets, right? It started rationale for, illegal drug trades, fentanyl and illegal immigration, and it moved on to some other topics like, Canada being 51st States of the U.S., and then more recently talking about, Canada, doesn't allow the U.S. bank to operate, which is totally a lie. So we know it's not fact. And it's just yesterday, he bring up something totally different. Is that if we could bring back all these automakers, right, from Canada, United States, we're going to stop the tariff. So basically, it's hard for people to navigate what's really going on in his mindsets. But from my point of view, as from an economic point of view, I think there's three rationales might ring a bell. Okay, the first one, trade deficit, which is actually doesn't collaborate as official stats of U.S. government. The total trade volume between the two countries, $700 billion, but the trade deficit is only $60 billion, less than 10%, and excluding, of course, oil and gas, actually U.S. will come out with a surplus because we sell to them, 70-80% oil and gas and at a heavy discount. The second thing I think is real is revenue generation. Yeah. And you see what happened here, the U.S. government is debt-laden. Has $1 trillion of debts and has ambitious plan, cutting tax, sending Australia to Mars. They have all this money, right? And essentially, this is what happened is shifting money from American consumers and also indirectly the Canadian producers to the government coffer, right? So to cover the shortfall. I think that's real motivation. He also mentioned that yesterday in a speech, right, to the Congress. This is the easiest way to make Americans rich, which fundamentally is wrong. We know that. It's actually lose-lose situation. And a third motivation, I think, is bargaining tool, right? It's really, I think, in many ways, in taking the predatory kind of approach, right? Taking the resources, the jobs, investment, from other countries. Our trading partner, for example, is calling the Canadian business to move to the U.S.
Yeah.
And which is unfortunately is happening according to most recent survey, KPMG. 48% large, medium-sized business consider moving the investment into states, which is very alarming.
So in a time of Buy Canadian, there's a survey you're mentioning where
yes.
medium to large-sized businesses are looking at setting up shop in the States to keep doing business.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay.
So we have, of course, response to it.
Yeah.
And we can talk about it a little bit later.
All right, we'll continue to unpack all that. Tom, what about yourself?
It's like negotiating with the mafia, Adam. And with the mafia, he's making you offers that you can't refuse. Yeah. And then if you disagree with him, like Zelensky did on Friday, you're having to apologize and write, "I'm really sorry" letters. And that causes confusion. It causes uncertainty. It causes anxiety. And I think we're seeing that, Rochelle could say from a sociological standpoint, at all levels of society. What people always ask me, like if Tony's an economist and I'm a business school professor, so I'm kind of a micro economist, I guess best way to describe it. And when you talk to people, so what does it mean for Newfoundland businesses? What does it mean for Newfoundland consumers and Labradorians, of course? And it's hard to tell them exactly what it's going to mean, but what we can say, and we heard the Prime Minister say this yesterday, it's going to result in increased costs. So I was reading a really interesting study from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, where they looked at the tariffs that were implemented in the first Trump regime against China. And all the American proponents for tariffs are saying, the consumers won't pay anything. This will be the exporter, i.e. the Chinese that pay it. And they looked at washer and dryers, and which were under tariffs then, because the first tariffs were more targeted rather than the blanket tariffs that we have now. And basically, the tariffs were 12%, and the cost of the goods went up 12%. And moreover, the dryers, which were not under the tariffs, it was funny, it was washing machines were, dryers were not. The dryers went up as well, so that the overall cost. So this is we've just come out of an era of higher inflation. People with fixed income are struggling. Moreover, businesses and social enterprises that are making long-term investments are struggling as well because costs have gone up. Budgeting is difficult. So we live in this time, and I've said this before on the signal of this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so what do we do? What are the strategies to address that, both at an individual level, an organizational level, and obviously the macro level from a government side? But it feels like we're dealing with the mafia.
Where's the stat? I wrote it down. The tracking when it came to Donald Trump and his first term, right? Because you talk about his whether it's false or misleading claims. There's other words that people use for this. But Daniel Dale, who used to be with the Washington Post, he's with CNN now. Before that, he was with the Toronto Star. But in Donald Trump's first term, so the 4 years, the Washington Post, this is the Washington Post of 4 years ago, not the current one. The Washington Post back then tracked 30,573 false or misleading claims over the first term, right? And to remind people, Donald Trump, convicted felon, found guilty of 34 charges in a scheme of illegally influence the 2016 election through a hush money payment to a porn actor who said the two had intercourse, right? So this is, and we all know this, who we're dealing with. So the question is like, what, for looking in the road ahead, how does Canada or Newfoundland and Labrador, how do we have that as the person, the decider for America, for the United States? How do we chart a course for trying to make decisions when, and to your mafia reference as well, Tom, right? Like, how do we move things forward when what gets said may or may not be true, often is not?
And moreover, just to quickly answer that, Adam, and then Tony and Rochelle are much more smarter than me, so I'm sure they'll give it. But even we had the U.S. Secretary of Commerce come out and say, well, these sanctions may only be a couple of days, and we'll get back to you on Friday. The problem is if you're a business or you're an individual and you're making decisions around tariffs that may or may not be there in the next 2-3 days, that's incredibly difficult when you're making budgetary investment, just basic operational decisions. And this is the problem. And it almost seems, and no, it doesn't seem, this is the second Trump administration was only been around for 65 days, which is crazy, not even 100 days, or maybe even 45 days. I'm not sure exactly, but we're not at 100 days yet. It's all about creating this chaos. It's around creating the uncertainty. When I was listening to the world news this morning, I thought the first thing they talk about tariffs, and they said no, it was actually the pausing of the funding to the Ukraine.
Right.
And so this is because Trump has done so many things, it makes everything uncertain. And the tariffs that we're having to deal with here in Newfoundland and Labrador are probably just one of 20, 50, 70 things that he's made big decisions on, whether it's DEI initiatives, whether it's basically Elon Musk with huge conflicts of interest going in and destroying the U.S. Federal government. And so now we're dealing with tariffs, and it's almost impossible to make really good, rational decisions because we don't know what he's going to look like in 2 weeks, much less 2 years from now.
I would like to add on what just Tom said. He spread out all this misinformation, rumors, and the lies, and so on, and create a lot of uncertainty. And one of them is just mentioned that it's really the Canadian exporters actually pay the tariffs, and now that the Americans is totally not true. I mean, gave the example of the China case, and in the North American case, this is even more severe because North American economy is much more integrated. For example, just for the car making, and you have the parts materials actually travel the border multiple times, right, before you get assembled.
Yeah,
so
like 7 or 8 times, right? The New York Times said for a car to go back and forth across the border before it's finished here in Canada, like in Ontario to across the border.
Right. Essentially, short term, that tariff can be more than 25% because you get to double or triple charge it. So that's really one of the concerns we have. The other thing is that I think in negotiation theory, the way how you create uncertainty sometimes give you up hands, right? I think that's what Trump is actually really kind of used to do. Right, that's part of his negotiation style. It's changing the story all the time. Just mentioned that what's rationale behind the tariffs, right? And also you mentioned that the businesses really don't like the stock market, for example. They don't like uncertainty, right? And that really hurts our capacity for long-term planning, right? Especially in terms of investment. right? So from that perspective, I think we need to have come up with a strategy. We know this is really detrimental, right, to our business, to our labor market. We need to come up, one of them, short term, we talk about buy Canadian, buy Newfoundland and Labrador, and we need to make that clear. And also, we need to remove all this barrier for internal trade. I think it's very important. We are a vast amount of country, right? We have, 10 provinces and, 2 territories and so on. We need to remove the barriers so we can, trade more smoothly within the country. And more long term, I think we should really diversify our trading relationship. We've been still comfortable for so many years, so many decades, right? Rely on single large trading partner, that's the United States. And we know the investment principle is always risky to put all our eggs in one basket. No, I think is wake-up call for both the policymakers at a business level, at the national level, to think about a long-term approach. Of course, adding to that is how to enhance our international competitiveness. We talk about in this program about productivity issue. We have huge gap with the United States into innovation, into competitiveness. It's now's the time. I think we should think about how we can actually improve our innovation, productivity, and competitiveness in the world market.
And folks, with Tony saying that, I will say that coming up Monday next week, there's a local group called Nucleus. So it's 3 experienced founders from the tech industry. Their goal is to establish the province as a global hub for healthcare innovation. So I'm going to have 3 of them in on Monday. And these are folks who, they say, this is a moment where we can expand business, do better, get global attention to what is being done here. And it's not with natural resources. This is with people power, and that's the show on Monday. So put that in your calendars, Signal listeners. It's going to be a great discussion. And we also have, it's going to be on the line as well from the Council of Canadian Innovators, Laurent Carbonneau. So there will be a national look to that. National, local, way forward. Rochelle, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are any conversation around innovation in this province is a great thing.
Yeah.
But on the current topic, though, thinking about what businesses need to be doing, thinking about what governments need to be doing, these are incredibly important conversations. But bringing it back to the average person on the street here in Newfoundland, that's who I think we're speaking to today, right? And so there's a lot of questions that people have, again, about what they can be doing to contribute. So we know that the cost of groceries is going to be going up. Yep. Cost of groceries has already been going up. People are having a hard time trying to make decisions around the food that they're going to bring home. There are conversations happening about the increased expense of electricity, right? That has nothing to do necessarily with the tariffs, but these are things that are impacting people today. And so the added stress and strain of tariffs is absolutely going to impact and stress people out even more than they probably already are. And so, one of these reactions that I think that we've been having not only here in Newfoundland and Labrador, but across the country as a whole, is that it's this buy Canadian mentality, it's buy local. But what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to show the United States of America that we are not happy with the policy decisions that they are making? So we're going to boycott going down to the States for trips. We're going to boycott American products. Or are we going to pursue this idea of buying Canadian, which is basically boycotting the world? And so how do we want to deal with that? How do we want to respond to that? And there's a multitude of ways that we can do that. We can go full bore. We can sign on to this very nationalistic way of thinking about our purchasing habits, and we can absolutely decide to buy local. It's a very important thing that we need to be doing, but is the point to basically show our displeasure and our dissatisfaction with policy decisions that are being made by the U.S. federal government. So that requires a boycott of American products and spending time in the U.S. And so to my mind, there's different reactions that we can be having to this, and everybody's going to land somewhere different. But if we're planning to boycott U.S. products, we can't find everything that we need just buying from Canadian businesses.
It's more complicated than that.
It's absolutely more complicated. I can't remember the statistic of the number of people in Canada that have iPhones, for example. Apple's an American company. So if we want to boycott technology, for example, we need to be looking at smartphones from other parts of the world. I don't believe we have a Canadian smartphone manufacturer, well, except for BlackBerry. I don't really know how they're doing.
Kind of petered out, right?
But the first one.
Go back and dust off the old BlackBerries, yeah.
Exactly. So, looking at making decisions and smart decisions about other parts of the world that we want to go to, we in this province specifically, if we think about the music scene, if we think about the theater scene, and we want to think about how we spend our disposable income, instead of buying music off of iTunes, for example, and supporting U.S. artists, or signing up for Netflix, signing up for Amazon Prime, doing all of these things that bring and support American businesses at the level of arts and culture. Do we want to support Canadian arts? Do we want to support Canadian cultural products? Do we want to support, Canadian television and radio and all of these other sorts of things? Because that would also help. We like to think that Canada and being Canadian is this distinct thing. And I think in a lot of ways we are. We have our own identity. I ask students every year, it's this big question in my ethnic relations course. What does it mean to be Canadian? What identifies us and distinguishes us as Canadian? And when you stop and think about it, it's kind of a hard question to answer, right? And so
it depends on which coast, what your family history background is, if you're a newcomer, if it's been generations, if it's rural, urban. The answer could be so. There's a diversity in that answer, right?
There's absolutely a diversity in that answer, and I think that that's one of the key things that distinguish us as being Canadian is that we pride ourselves on that diversity, and we value that diversity. And so, if that's the case, what that means is that when we're making decisions about how to spend our money, boycott American. That sends a strong response to the U.S. government that we are unhappy with policy. But think about buying local, absolutely, supporting local businesses here in Newfoundland or in Canada, but look to other potential areas of the world that you can also be supporting. We're not the only ones that are being hit with tariffs here. And so if we do want to start developing, rich trade partnerships and diversifying our economic participation, maybe that's a place that we need to be going, and it's an easy thing to research and think about.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today we're talking about, Trump tariffs, U.S. tariffs, Canada's response, what it means for all of us here in Newfoundland and Labrador. If you have thoughts on this, right, thoughts on the tariffs, the responses, the impacts might be for yourself personally or this people in this province, the communities of this province, give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. You can text us, 709-327-8206. The Signal at cbc.ca. If you just want to dart us a little note. You were just listening to Rochelle Cote, Associate Professor with the Department of Sociology and the Faculty of Business Administration at Memorial. Tom Cooper's here, business prof. Tony Fang is here as well, economist, Department of Economics professor. Daryl's on the line from Gander. How you doing?
Good, and yourself?
Good. Well, all things considered, doing okay. Thoughts for the show today?
Well, I'm going to amalgamate a few things into one. For one thing, interprovincial trade in Canada is $240 billion. And I don't understand why the governments are not following, especially the Australia model. They got a stellar system in place when it comes to interprovincial trade, and with certainly the European Union. That's what they should be looking at for, and especially $240 billion. That's a lot of money, and that's within Canada alone. And you look at the Germany model for retail. You go to shop in Germany, it's all German products first, and then everything else is secondary. But what I'm going to add to the mix here today, and nobody's talking about this, is the free trade agreement. And under the free trade agreement, they cannot put any tariffs because of the free trade agreement. Mexico came out and made that statement there. I think as of yesterday, they cannot put tariffs due to the free trade agreement. But there's no political will on the provincial, federal. They're not talking about it, and the reason why, because they're being reactive, because it's election year. So when you're being reactive, it looks like they're fighting and they're hoping to, score points rather than being proactive and focus on the free trade agreement. Nobody's talking about it, because under this free trade agreement, that's challenged. They cannot do it, and that expires, I think, in 2026. So I don't understand why that avenue is not being talked about.
All right, Daryl, thanks for that. I'm going to put that to the guests here now because, I think, and Tony's teaching a course in it. So let's get down to how they're making this possible, what's happening, and what the response can be with the WTO. So thanks so much, Daryl.
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Daryl. And the spirit of the WTO and North American Free Trade Agreement is remove the barriers, to reduce the tariffs. They've been very successful doing that, right? Within the trade blocks, actually, we essentially reduce the tariff to zero to most of the goods and services. Actually, expand, consumption, we just Rocha talk about, and actually make the goods more accessible and more affordable. And, in terms of the internal trade, I totally agree with Daryl. We should remove no reason we cannot remove the barriers, right? And we should make also the label very clear, right? This is made in Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador. I certainly agree that, maybe to some extent we send a signal, right, to the American policymakers. We're not happy with the way how you treat us, the close ally, and, and largest trading partner. And on the other hand, we also should diversify our trading relationship, as I mentioned that, not we only trade with the United States, but, we can sell oil and gas at a high price to European countries, to the Asian countries. Why wouldn't do this, right? It's because we have this free trade agreements, right? And Donald Trump, violated, right? This
so
agreement.
This is the question. Yeah. So when you have that trade, like the update, right? Because it was NAFTA, and then it turned into CUSMA, and that was like Trump 1.0, right? We're at 2.0 now. So they update a trade agreement, and now he's saying, tariffs. Here we go. Like, how is that possible, Tony?
Yeah, I tell you this is that how they make this possible, and you just mentioned that that U.S. Mexico Canada agreement was invented by Trump. He said at that time is the best agreement possible.
Yeah, he's saying something different now, I think.
No, he just broke it, right? So essentially, how the country can unilaterally violate the free trade agreements, under the principle WTO and in a free trade agreement within North America, and there is certain kind of exception that have been set under WTO. That's one of them is that the national emergency. That's the reason why Trump on day one in office he declared national emergency on the south border. Right? He cited. Right, when he slapped this 25% tariff, cited 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, right, in the events of national emergency, right, as exception.
So he comes out, says there's a border emergency, and he talks about fentanyl and stuff, and that is the lever to pull for being able to put tariffs on. Ton, jump on it.
Yeah, no, just to follow off what Tony was saying. So Trump and the Americans, as well as the Chinese, have really kind of stepped away from the WTO.
Yeah.
And so the WTO, which should be the adjudicator that this is not the right thing to do, really doesn't have the teeth and or the ability to really adjudicate this, because what Trump has done is, as Tony has indicated, is just basically ripped up and said, I'm going to do whatever I want. And this kind of unilateralism, this kind of dictatorship, the F word, not the bad F word, well, actually both bad, the fascism in terms of trying to do this is not what we've been doing since 1945. Since 1945, we've been negotiating. We come in, if there's agreement, we come together and we kind of do things from there and we figure out a way forward. And this is one of the things which is so difficult is that Trump is doing a lot of things and just saying, okay, well, I'll break it and I'll sort it out later on, whether it's going to be in court or whether it's going to be somewhere else. And so, yeah, he can do this because by the time we fix this, even if it got to the WTO and everyone backed us up, we could be months, we could be years, we could be, this could be catastrophic for us as a Canadian economy. Especially if it's escalating. So if he says, like he said, on April 2nd, if you put 25, we'll put 25% on more. So we'll be paying 50%. And then at that point, we have to do all the tactical things that Rochelle and Tony were indicating, whether that's figuring out new markets. So if we can't get oranges from Florida, we better figure out how do we get oranges from South Africa. But that's still going to be costly in terms of trying to get to that. And how, moreover, as a Canadian consumer, can I even afford oranges at that point?
Yeah.
And this is what the danger is that, my grandparents, who I was especially close to, grew up in the Great Depression, and they would just tell me stories in terms of, what they struggled to get and what they didn't struggle to get, and how I've always felt myself privileged and blessed to live in this great time. And now Trump and the MAGA movement is basically ripping that all up for basically ideological. And for me, I can see it as a business school professor for some monetary reasons, which nobody's really talking about as well.
To grow, especially for those of us growing up from the whole have-not conversation to have conversation for Newfoundland and Labrador, to see relative growth kind of increase and families thrive because of this over the years, and now this question mark, right? Like, Rochelle?
Yeah.
Sorry, Rochelle, your thoughts?
I mean, Tom, it's funny, when Tom first started speaking, he thought of Trump as kind of dealing with the mafia. And I kind of have been thinking of Trump as Canada learning what it's like to deal with an abusive partner.
Yeah.
Constant gaslighting to just try to force submission and get us to go back to the Americans and do whatever they want. And so, probably the mafia mentality is very, very similar to that in some ways. But no, I just... in terms of where I'm coming from, looking at, I guess, the reasons and the rationale that Trump is trying to enact the tariffs and saying, well, it's fentanyl at the border. It's, this increase in migrants that are trying to move across the border. And there's no data to support this. A DEA report from a couple of years ago, Canada was a footnote in their report when they were talking about the countries who are responsible for bringing that particular drug into the country. And yet, as Trudeau was saying yesterday, we want to be good neighbors. So we appointed a fentanyl czar. We brought more, people to enforce the border. And we managed to decrease the supply of fentanyl, down to even more negligible numbers. The number of migrants that we've got crossing from Canada down into the U.S. is also negligible when you compare with the number of individuals who are coming up from, South and Central America through Mexico across that border into the U.S. So there's nothing about what Trump is saying beyond what Tony is suggesting in terms of enacting these emergency clauses to... There's nothing legitimate in what he's saying about trying to enact these tariffs. And so, I know that Trudeau mentioned in his press conference yesterday that his plan is to try to litigate. But as Tom very rightly points out, we're months, years away from any kind of a decision if we decide to go down that road.
Go ahead, Tony, then we'll go to the phones.
Come
Yeah,
on,
quickly, yeah.
exactly on WTO, and both China and Canada has pursued the legal channel against the United States through WTO. Actually, the reason why WTO was established over GATT exactly because established the trade dispute channels, the peer panels, and so on, and the way how the United States weakened that function of the WTO. One is that dragging on this for a long period of time, months and months. The second is that, actually the United States withdraw some of the exports from these peer panels, which essentially, make that timely verdict impossible, right? It essentially paralyze the trade dispute resolution mechanism of WTO.
Right. All right. Let's go to the, thanks for that. Caroline's on the line from St. John's. Hi.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Good. Hey, how you doing?
I'm all right. I'm probably watching too much news.
Oh, hey, join the club.
Trying to keep on top of things. Just a couple of observations. I've been watching a lot of international news out of the UK and Europe. I am actually a dual citizen. I'm an EU citizen as well as a Canadian citizen, born here, but an EU citizen through my mother. So I have a particularly vested interest in what's going on in Europe right now because the country that I'm also a citizen of is Finland, who has had their own dealings with Russia in the past. After World War II, they lost a significant amount of their land mass. They were also attacked unprovoked. And, if Ukraine falls, Finland is probably the next one of the next targets. So, we watch this very carefully. But just a few observations. I think we can all agree that at this point, Trump is unstable. We should assume that everything he says is, in fact, a lie and unsubstantiated. And that, if we are going to come out of this, we really have to, as Canadians, make some hard choices in how we're living our lives. And that means maybe giving up some of the things that we've come to enjoy and like, and if it means paying, 30 cents more for a can of something in the grocery store to buy Canadian or to buy from another country versus the U.S., that it's important that we do this because overall, this is how we're going to keep our economy going and the economies of our allies. With regard to our oil, I was watching a really interesting program on Sky News in the UK, and they were dissecting the fact that Europe is actually a little bit too dependent on Russia right now. 25% of the oil that gets used in Europe comes from Russia. And, I'm wondering if we can't, fill that gap for them and make them less dependent and conversely make us less dependent on the U.S. as a customer. And I'm hoping those conversations are going on behind the scenes because it seems like with companies like Equinor already here, it would be a logical pipeline for us to exploit those kinds of resources. But I really just want to encourage folks to really look at your choices. And it doesn't seem like a big thing, but if we all collectively make small little choices. I personally was going to go to a work conference this year in Las Vegas. I've made the decision not to do so and canceled that trip. I also want to alert consumers that I feel like I'm calling it maple washing going on already at the retail level. I'm really heartened to see people in the stores actually looking at labels, looking at tags, seeing where things are made. A huge number of people are doing it, which is awesome. But there's some deceptive practices going on with some retailers where they're, on the tag on the shelf, it'll have a big maple leaf on it. But if you actually pick up the product and look at it, it's not Canadian. So really, don't just trust the signs because I think there's there's some shadiness happening, and I'm really hoping that provincially and federally we're going to see some legislation come through about that, about getting better labeling for Canadian products and also some penalties for companies that are trying to masquerade as Canadian when they're not.
Lots of great points there, Caroline. I appreciate your call.
Thank you.
Cheers. Caroline calling from St. John's. Before I go back to my guests in studio, so if you got thoughts, just pin those for a minute. We've got Sheena on the line from Deer Lake. How you doing?
Well, how am I doing? Just like everyone else.
Yeah.
It's just so overwhelmed. But somebody did bring up just a few minutes ago about going back to 1930, sort of looking at a historic approach. Anyway, I thought I heard a comment about that. But anyway, I'm calling in because I just wanted to talk about, to try to understand why Trump is doing at least this tariff war and is now being very nonchalant about, he doesn't care about what happens to American consumers, the people who actually voted for him, as opposed to us who, of course, didn't, but wouldn't have. That reminds me of what my parents were talking about from having lived through the Great Depression, and some of the things I've read about what happened in the Great Depression, and this will give perhaps some insight to how Trump is looking at the big picture, which is, yes, families, people who aren't wealthy will suffer because of the tariffs. And again, he says, oh, well, it's going to cost a little more, but you'll see it's worth it. Well, because he can afford to say that. But if it gets really, really bad and people in the States start losing their homes or walking away from homes or, essentially just trashing the entire economy, what happens is Trump's very wealthy friends will buy up whatever, people are walking away from. And I'm thinking particularly real estate, but it could also be businesses going bankrupt. And then they can just sit on it until things get better and the values soar again. And I think that we don't really know. We'll never know what's going through that man's mind. Probably don't want to know. But at least in terms of the masters he's serving, if you look at, back to what history has taught us about economic collapse, particularly in Western nations, that is one thing to put in like, oh, now there's maybe vaguely a bit of sense into it.
Thank you for that, Sheena. I'm going to put this, yourselves, your comments and Caroline's comments to my guests here, and we'll keep the conversation rolling. I appreciate the call as always.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. All right. And Tom, when we chatted before the show, you lived in Europe with the whole ending of the USSR, right? What is this time speaking to you? And it could maybe touch on some of Sheena's comments there, or anything else you want to say.
Sure. I remember I was a doctoral student in the UK when what was happening in the Soviet Union. And as a business PhD student, I was going, how do I take advantage of this? How can I make opportunities? But when you looked at the news that was coming through then, there was just a huge power grab by a small number of individuals who now we know as the oligarchs, who basically took all these national owned industries, whether it was steel, aluminum, potash, whatever they had, and that suddenly fell into the hands of individuals on pennies on the dollar, basically. So they got it for pretty much nothing. And that could happen, and I take Sheena's point, and as I was nodding when she was saying this, and there's that could happen. That is a scenario. It may not be the most probable scenario, but it's a possibility, right? And it worries me, and it's clear, like just in terms of Elon Musk, who has these big government contracts already, getting rid of the federal bureaucracy basically means, oh, we're going to privatize a lot more things. And suddenly who's going to be the company that could privatize it? Probably one of Elon Musk's. So there's those kind of options. The only thing I would speak to, and I think this is more the the second caller's point, I was an MC for a wedding in Toronto this past spring, and it was half Texas, half Canadian. And the Texans were, I was told not to mention Trump. by the people who were organizing the wedding, but they were all hardcore Trump supporters. And if they were going to, if I was going to, and they were the nicest people, right? You know, super nice people, and their values were basically based around country, God, and then Trump. Country, God, Dallas Cowboys, and then Trump. And I think once again is the lack of information. They don't have the CBC down there. They don't have the span of the news that they're getting. It's very, very limited. And from a sociological perspective, Rochelle, it's fascinating in terms of this cult of Trumpism that comes through. And we in Canada don't get that. We don't have that. And we're going, why is this man doing this? And it's, to me, there's a whole, we could be here for weeks literally talking about the psychological, sociological, anthropological, economic, business implications in terms of what's going on. But all I can say is that we want to be instead of isolating ourselves like the Americans want, I think we got to be talking to our American friends and talking to those people who are hardcore Trump supporters and just saying, what's going on? Why? And if it's on the culture wars, okay, that's one thing. But, there's also just, if you lose your house, if you lose your job, if you lose a whole bunch of things because you support this man, then why are you doing that? And have that kind of question.
Rochelle.
The one thing I was reflecting on, and I think we're all old enough in this room to appreciate the reference, but back in 1998, Rick Mercer was doing a segment where he'd go down to the States and
talking to Americans.
And, I remember, being much younger, but thinking that it was kind of funny that, Americans couldn't answer basic questions about Canada. But, I think reflecting on it right now in this climate where I think we're seeing the consequences of this lack of education, maybe in American school systems, but I even think more generally in that, we have trading partners right now that don't know a lot outside of their own very specific national and maybe even state context, right? And so, I think it is incredibly important to be having those conversations with our American friends, with our American families. But to my mind, what's also incredibly important is that we don't allow this to happen here in Canada. We don't allow ourselves to get siloed and forget that, we need to know what's going on, not only about south of the border, but we actually need to be reflecting on what's happening here in our country in terms of the kinds of conversations that we need to be having as a country to ensure that, we continue to have a highly educated population, that we continue to have really pretty great health outcomes, even though, sometimes we don't necessarily think that that's the case. So to my mind, yes, let's talk about the U.S., let's educate our American neighbors, but let's keep on doing that exact same thing here in our country to make sure that we don't let this kind of thing happen here in our country as well.
Tony.
Yeah, speaking to the Americans, I mean, during the election campaign, of course, Trump spread a lot of rhetorics, right, about how to make America great again by bringing all the jobs back to the U.S., right? And a lot of Trump supporters believe in those rhetorics, right? So I think it's important for us to crush those myths, right, those kind of rhetorics. I would like to provide some kind of economic insight why this would not happen, right? The first is that a lot of the American manufacturers using the Canadian inputs, materials, and so on. If you put on, tariffs on the imports, would make their, goods and services more expensive, less competitive in the world market. The second is that, if, he imposed tariffs on us, right? Canadian goods and services said we'll get less income, right? Even we would like to buy American goods, services, we cannot because we have less income. The third is that we're not going to stand still. Of course, you can see already the Canadian business and the Canadian general public and the all-level governments are strongly, upholding a position, right, to put in even retaliation tariffs. You talk about Buy Canadian, all those kind of initiatives to fend off the the threat. So, that would make actually, the American export more difficult. Finally, also from the foreign exchange point of view, and those kind of tariff would make the American dollar stronger, against Canadian dollars and pesos and so on. And again, make the American goods service more expensive in the international market, right? So all it does add up. If we add all this up, right, and actually create less job than the job lost because of trade wars. I give you an example. The first term of Trump administration, he imposed the tariffs on our steel and aluminum, right? It does create 1,000 jobs, 1,000 jobs for the steel industry, but lost 40,000 jobs, because the steel users suffered, right, from that tariffs.
All right. Thanks for that example. And I like the confidence because it's paving the road to hope for people. Tony, let's go back to the phones. Ron is on the line from St. John's. Hi, Ron.
Yes, hi. Yeah, I think what we're witnessing is the Putinization of America. There was an interesting concept by a lady who writes for the Le Devoir, the newspaper, saying that there's a possibility that Trump is aligning himself with Putin, and the bottom line is that Trump is trying to cripple the Canadian economy. So then, if Putin comes in on the north to take over the Arctic, and then Trump will extort an agreement from Canada to join the States in exchange for protection against the Russian invasion. It's an interesting concept, at the risk of sounding like a conspiracist, but it's a concept that's there, right?
Yeah, there's lots to think about, right, Ron? There's lots of concern: Arctic sovereignty, Arctic security for Canada, the defense spending getting up over 2% for the GDP or beyond, and questions around that and what that means for us in Canada and the U.S. and whether or not NATO still exists down the road. There's lots to talk about, and I think your concern is echoing a lot of other folks' concerns that I've seen online and spoken with folks out in the community about.
I think Trump worships Putin, apparently, and he's aligning himself with that axis,
He's had some friendly words for him, totally. I'm going to get back to the guests here for a wrap-up because we're running out of time. But, Ron, thanks for that call very much.
You're welcome, Alan.
Cheers. All right, Ron calling from St. John's. All right, folks, about a minute left each. Final thoughts. Oh, and we had an email. Our family has an anything except the U.S. when we shop rule. We don't want to not support other countries who we want on our side. That's from Mike. So thanks for that email, Mike. Rochelle, final, wherever you want to go with this, it could be optimistic or not or realistic or whatever. Choose your own adventure.
Choose my own adventure. I'd kind of like to make a plug not only for encouraging interprovincial trade, facilitating interprovincial trade, but, we have been having a conversation in this country right now around reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And one partner in all of this that I don't see being represented in conversations around tariffs, around trade, is trade and working with Indigenous peoples in this country in terms of their economic production and what they're contributing to our GDP. A report a couple of years ago, $50 billion to Canada's GDP. Even in just Newfoundland alone, we have a host of Indigenous businesses here that I'm sure would enjoy contributing not only to this conversation, but to economic development here as well. So, it's kind of, again, it's thinking about what we have as values as Canadians and who we need to be talking to be participating in these conversations and ensuring that everybody's being represented and reflected.
Tony, under a minute for you.
Well, yeah, this is a serious matter, of course. If this 25% is really put into effects and we could, have a recession. Our GDP could decline by 2.5%, and we lose, 600,000 jobs, and that's really, serious matter. I think we should work together, right? All potential initiative we talk about, short-term, long-term. Short-term, we should actually remove the barriers for internal trade, diversify our trading relations, including oil and gas. Let's a little bit state dependency. I think we should think about European countries, nation countries. They are all hungry for our goods and services, and also think about long-term. We should invest our critical infrastructure and enhance our international competitiveness. and we should not actually all rely on one single, trading partner. So, yeah, we should work together. Stand up for Canada.
Tom Cooper, final word.
Educate ourselves, listen to great media like The Signal and the CBC and all the other news sources out there so that we're getting the facts. We're understanding the numbers. We're understanding that fentanyl was 20 kilograms that was caught at the northern border. I can lift 20 kilograms, or I used to when I was playing rugby. But nonetheless, it's not very much. And so we got to make sure that we distinguish the facts from the Trumpisms. So thank you so much for having us.
Tom Cooper, Tony Fang, Rochelle Cote, thank you very much, folks. That is it for another episode of The Signal. If you've got thoughts for us, get in touch anytime. The Signal at cbc.ca. You can call the Signal line and leave a message, 709-576-5260. Tomorrow on the show, many people in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. An unexpected disruption can lead to a life crisis, food insecurity, even homelessness. Now imagine that and you're a kid, right? You're a kid facing a life crisis. We have experts coming in and advocates to talk about young folks and what we're doing wrong, but also how to make it right.